Welcome back to Silent Paws and Brave Hearts. The dog stopped walking. That was the first sign. In 11 years of living and working beside Ranger, Daniel Hayes had learned to read the animal the way a sailor reads the sea, not with his eyes alone, but with something deeper, something that lived below thought, below language, in that quiet animal place where instinct speaks louder than reason. And right now, every nerve in Daniel's body was receiving the same message that Ranger's body was already broadcasting. Something was wrong. They were deep in the national forest outside Black Hollow, Montana. The pines stood so thick and tall around them that the pale October morning barely reached the ground. The air smelled of wet earth and pine resin and something else, something faint and cold that Daniel could not name but recognized the way you recognize a sound from a dream. Ranger's ears were forward, his nose was working, his entire body had gone from the relaxed looseness of a morning walk to something else entirely, something coiled and certain and operational. Daniel stood still and watched him. He had learned long ago never to rush what Ranger was feeling. The dog had saved his life twice in Afghanistan, once by alerting to an IED buried beneath a stretch of road that looked like every other stretch of road, and once by throwing his own body in front of a threat before Daniel had even registered the danger. Ranger had come home from that war with a scar that ran along his left flank from shoulder to hip, a permanent record of what he had given. Daniel had come home with his own scars. His were just harder to see. Ranger moved. Not quickly, not in the frantic, chaotic way of an excited animal, but with that slow, deliberate precision that Daniel recognized from combat. The dog moved like he had a destination, like he had always known this destination. He pushed through a curtain of low-hanging branches and disappeared into the shadow beyond, and Daniel followed without a word, his boots finding the ground carefully, his breath measured and quiet in the cold morning air. They walked for nearly 20 minutes through terrain that grew rougher and more tangled with every step. The trail disappeared entirely. The trees pressed closer. Twice Daniel lost sight of Ranger in the shadows and found him again only by the soft sound of paws on wet leaves. His mind was beginning to form questions, practical questions, the kind a man asks when he is trying to stay in the present and not slide backward into the past, when Ranger stopped again. They were standing before a wall of rock. It was not dramatic at first glance, just a face of dark stone rising from the forest floor, covered in decades of vine and moss, the kind of geological feature you could walk past 100 times and never notice. But Ranger was not interested in the rock face. He was interested in what was at its base, a narrow, low opening barely visible beneath a tangle of old growth, the entrance to something that had been swallowed by the forest and forgotten by the world. An abandoned mine shaft. Daniel's military training moved through him automatically. He scanned the perimeter. He noted the position of the sun above the tree line. He checked his footing. Then he looked at Ranger, who was already at the opening, nose pressed to the dark earth just inside the entrance, digging with quiet urgency. Not frantically, not desperately, but with the focused insistence of an animal who knows exactly what he is doing and why. Daniel knelt beside him. The earth at the entrance was disturbed, not recently, but not ancient either. He could see where someone had worked at the rock, had moved material, had interacted with this place over a long period of time. He reached into the loose soil where Ranger was digging, and his fingers touched something small and hard. He pulled it free and held it up in the thin morning light. It was a bracelet. Cheap plastic, the kind sold at county fairs and school carnivals, the kind a mother buys for a child without thinking twice, because it costs almost nothing and means almost everything to a 7-year-old who wants to feel special. The plastic was degraded by time and moisture, but the letters pressed into it were still legible. Daniel read the name once silently. Then he sat back on his heels in the cold Montana dirt, and something moved through him that was not quite grief, and not quite recognition, and not quite horror, but some terrible combination of all three, arriving at once, like a wave that has been traveling a very long distance, and finally, without warning, reaches the shore. He read the name again. Ethan. The town of Black Hollow had not spoken that name above a whisper in nearly 2 years. Ethan Cole, 7 years old, disappeared from Riverside Park on a warm June afternoon while his mother sat 30 feet away reading a book in the sun. One moment he was there, feeding ducks at the water's edge, laughing at something only a child can find funny in the simple movement of birds. And then he was not there, and then he was nowhere, and then he was simply gone. The way children go when the world fails them, completely, without explanation, without mercy. 2 years of searches, 2 years of news reports and candlelight vigils and faded missing posters on telephone poles slowly bleached white by the sun. 2 years of a mother who did not sleep, and a father who stopped speaking in full sentences, and a community that slowly, heartbreakingly, began the process of accepting the unacceptable. And now, Daniel Hayes was kneeling in the cold dirt of a forgotten forest, holding a dead child's bracelet in his scarred hands, while his dog pressed his face into a mine shaft and refused to move. He pulled out his phone with steady hands, steady not because he was calm, but because he had been trained for years to be steady precisely in the moments when steadiness was the hardest thing in the world, and he called Sheriff Mark Dalton. He said very few words. He did not need many. Within 40 minutes, the forest was no longer quiet. The mine entrance had to be widened carefully before anyone could enter safely. It took 2 hours. Daniel stood back and watched, and Ranger sat beside him, perfectly still now, his great head turning slowly to follow each movement of the workers with the calm authority of a soldier who has passed the mission to the next team and is waiting to be needed again. An FBI agent named Laura Bennett arrived with a forensic team and a satellite phone and the particular kind of controlled efficiency that people develop when they have spent years working cases where children do not come home. She walked the perimeter with sharp eyes and took photographs and spoke in clipped sentences into her phone. Sheriff Dalton found a moment to stand beside Daniel. He was a big man, silver-haired, with hands like paddles and a face that had absorbed 30 years of other people's worst days without breaking. He looked at Daniel the way men look at each other when there is too much to say and not enough language to say it in. "Good dog," he said, finally. Daniel looked at Ranger. "Yes," he said, "he always was." When the forensic team finally entered the mine and their lights moved across the interior walls, the first thing they reported was the marks. Hundreds of them, carved into the stone with something small and sharp, a rock perhaps, or a piece of broken metal. Straight lines grouped in fives, the universal human language of counting days. The team counted them slowly, methodically, and when the number was confirmed and radioed out, Agent Bennett closed her eyes for just a moment, just one brief human moment, before her face returned to its professional composure. 731 days. 2 years. Carved one day at a time into the walls of a dark mine by a child who refused to let time swallow him whole. A child who had decided, in whatever fierce and fragile way a 7-year-old decides things, that he was going to be found, that someone was going to come, that the story was not over. They found the notebook behind a loose rock near the back of the shaft, wrapped carefully in a piece of plastic sheeting that had been folded and refolded with great deliberateness.
The cover was decorated in small, careful drawings, a crown, a torch, a mountain, and across the front in the unsteady but determined handwriting of a child who had learned to write in better times, 4 words that broke every heart in that cold Montana forest. The Prince in the Shadow Mine. Daniel sat with the notebook in gloved hands and read portions of it while the team worked around him. The entries were not the words of a broken child. They were something more extraordinary than that. The words of a child who had taken his breaking and built something from the pieces. Ethan had given himself a name in the darkness, a title, a story. He was the prince, imprisoned in the shadow mine, and somewhere out there in the light, his mother, his queen, was searching every corner of the world to find him. The story was sometimes childlike and sometimes achingly wise. In one entry, he wrote that a prince does not cry because he is afraid. He cries because he loves the people he cannot reach. And then he cries no more. And then he gets back to work. The final entry described a storm, water rising in the shaft, a crack in the ceiling that he had spent weeks widening with his hands, a moment of terrible decision, and then escape. The boy had gotten out. He was alive. Somewhere out there in the vast Montana wilderness, a 9-year-old boy who had survived 2 years of darkness was moving, and so were the people who had put him there. What followed in the next 18 hours was the kind of controlled chaos that Daniel had not been part of since his last deployment. The rapid assembly of information, the reading of evidence, the construction of a picture from scattered pieces. He stayed at the periphery at first, watching, offering nothing, because he understood that he was a civilian now, and that the machinery of law enforcement had its own logic and its own rhythm. But then he saw something. It was a knot on a piece of rope near the mine entrance, tied around an old support beam in a way that was specific and unusual. A marlinspike hitch, modified with an extra half-turn. The kind of knot taught in wilderness survival courses that were not widely available. The kind of knot used by people who spend serious time in serious backcountry. Daniel had seen it before, not in Montana, in training, in a manual used by a very specific category of wilderness professional.
He mentioned it to Agent Bennett quietly. She looked at him for a long moment, the way she had been looking at him all day, with that particular combination of assessment and reluctant respect, and then she pulled up a database on her satellite tablet and began to search. 2 hours later, they had a name. Emily Carter, former environmental officer, a woman who had lost her husband and daughter in a car accident 4 years ago and had disappeared from the world of the living shortly afterward. A woman who had crossed paths with a man named Victor Hale, a dangerous recluse who believed with absolute and terrible conviction that he was protecting children from a corrupt world by removing them from it. And there was one more name, a niece, Lily Carter. Young, frightened, and, according to a neighbor who had been quietly interviewed that afternoon, carrying something heavy, something that had been eating her alive for 2 years. When Sheriff Dalton brought Lily Carter into a quiet room that evening and simply sat across from her without speaking, the way only a man who has seen everything and judged nothing can sit, the weight she had been carrying finally became too much. She wept for a long time, and then she told them everything, including where they were going. Raven's Peak, the old fire watch tower, the place the locals called the end of the world. They moved before dawn. Daniel was not supposed to be part of the team that climbed that mountain. He was a civilian. He was not armed. He had not been operational in over a decade. But when the assembled team gathered at the trailhead in the blue-black darkness of 4 in the morning, and Ranger walked to the front of the group and sat down and looked back at Daniel with those amber eyes that had never once asked for anything except the chance to be useful, Sheriff Dalton looked at Agent Bennett, and Agent Bennett looked at the mountain, and then she looked at Daniel and said simply, "Stay close." The climb was hard and cold and long. The trail to the fire tower switchbacked up through terrain that was technically demanding even in daylight. In the darkness before dawn, with frost on the rocks and a wind coming down from the summit that found every gap in every layer of clothing, it was something else entirely. But Daniel moved through it with his body remembering things his conscious mind had almost forgotten. The rhythm of uphill movement under pressure, the conservation of energy, the management of discomfort, the maintenance of focus when every physical sensation is arguing for rest. They reached the tower as the first gray light was beginning to separate the sky from the mountains.
It was empty. For one terrible moment, the team stood in the cold silence of the summit and the emptiness of the tower and felt the specific despair of arriving too late. Agent Bennett's face showed nothing, but Daniel could see it in the set of her shoulders. Sheriff Dalton turned slowly, scanning the tree line. And then Ranger moved. Not toward the tower, away from it, down a slight slope to the northeast into a stand of old timber that backed up against a granite outcropping. He moved with that same slow, certain, operational deliberateness that had brought them to the mine, the movement of an animal who is not searching anymore because he is already found. They followed. The cellar doors were set into the earth at the base of the granite, covered with decades of pine duff and deliberately disguised with cut branches. They would not have found them before full daylight. They would have been too late. The doors burst open. A woman stumbled out into the gray morning light, dragging a small boy by the hand, not protecting him, restraining him, pulling him back into the darkness, even as he fought toward the light. Victor Hale was behind them, and for a brief and terrible moment, the summit was full of shouting and motion and the ancient animal chaos of confrontation. And then it was over. And Daniel was kneeling on the cold ground, and there was a child in front of him. He was small, pale as birch bark. His eyes were enormous in his thin face, the eyes of a child who has spent 2 years reading the dark and has become very, very good at it. He was shaking, not just from cold, from the shock of light, of space, of faces, of the sudden overwhelming reality of a world he had convinced himself still existed, but had not seen in so long that some part of him had stopped believing. Daniel did not think, he did not plan, he did not reach back into his training or his experience or his years of discipline. He simply moved forward, the way the heart moves when it finally, after a very long time, recognizes something it has been looking for. He knelt in the frost and pine needles before this thin, pale boy, and he looked at him, and he said the only words that existed in that moment, the only words that had ever mattered in any moment like this one, in any dark place, in any war, in any mine, in any corner of the world where a person has been waiting a very long time to be told that the waiting is over. You're safe now. The boy looked at him for one long, trembling moment.
And then Ethan Cole, who had survived 731 days alone in the dark by deciding every single morning that he was a prince and that his story was not finished, broke open completely, the way only a child can break, with his whole body and his whole heart, and without any of the careful management that adults apply to their grief. He wept the way he had not allowed himself to weep for 2 years, because weeping meant giving up, and he had never once given up. He wept for everything he had missed, for his mother's arms, for sunlight, for the sound of a dog barking in a yard somewhere normal and safe. And Daniel Hayes, who had carried a dead child's weight in his heart for 13 years, who had come to these mountains not to heal, but to hide, who had believed in the most private and painful chamber of his soul that he was not worth the space he occupied in the world, held this living child against his chest and wept too.
Ranger pressed against both of them and was still. The months that followed moved the way healing moves, not in straight lines, not quickly, with setbacks and silences and days that were harder than the day before. Victor Hale and Emily Carter faced justice. Lily Carter's testimony, delivered through tears in a quiet courtroom, became the thread that tied the case together and gave Ethan's family the answers they had spent 2 years without. Ethan went home. He learned to sleep with the lights off again, slowly, 1 degree of darkness at a time. He learned to eat without hoarding. He learned that open spaces were not threats. His mother held him every morning for the first 3 months, as if checking that he was still real, still present, still hers. His father read to him every night, ordinary books about ordinary things, baseball and dinosaurs and distant planets, as a way of rebuilding the architecture of a normal childhood, 1 small brick at a time. And Ethan asked about the Marine and his dog. He asked quietly at first, the way children ask about things they are not sure they are allowed to want. Then more directly, then with the particular focused insistence of a child who has learned that the things worth having are worth asking for clearly and without apology. The visits began in the spring. Daniel would arrive at the Cole family home on Saturday mornings with Ranger walking beside him, and Ethan would be waiting on the front porch before the truck had finished pulling into the driveway. He and Ranger had a greeting ritual that they had developed entirely on their own, a specific sequence of ear scratches and nose touches, and the low, happy sound Ranger made only for Ethan, that Daniel watched every time with something in his chest that it took him a while to identify because he had not felt it in so long. It was joy. On a morning in late summer, Ethan's parents sat across from Daniel at their kitchen table and asked him something that required more courage from them than Daniel fully understood at first. They asked him to be Ethan's godfather. He said no, gently but without hesitation, because he had a reason prepared, the same reason he had been preparing for years, the same reason he had used to keep every good thing at arm's length. He was broken. He was not the right person. There were better men, whole men, men who had not failed children in dark places on the other side of the world. Ethan's mother reached across the table and placed her hand over his scarred one, and she looked at him the way only a mother who has been to the edge of losing everything and been brought back can look at another person. "You didn't just save our son," she said. "You gave him his future." Daniel looked at her hand on his. He looked at Ranger lying in the sunlight by the back door. He thought about a photograph above a fireplace and a smile he could no longer remember wearing. He thought about a boy in an Afghan desert and a boy in a Montana mine, and the strange and terrible and beautiful way that the universe sometimes offers the same lesson twice, because the first time you were not ready to receive it. He said yes. In the last days of that summer, Daniel walked a sunlit trail in the mountains above Black Hollow with a 9-year-old boy beside him and a German shepherd running ahead, disappearing into the light and coming back and disappearing again, the way happy dogs do when the world is good and the air is clean and the people they love are near. Daniel was teaching Ethan to listen to the mountains, to hear the difference between wind in pine needles and wind in open rock, to read the way a deer moves through brush, to understand that silence is not absence, that it is in fact the fullest and most honest language the natural world speaks. Ethan listened with his whole body, the way children listen when they are truly present, when the world has taught them the cost of not paying attention and the gift of being allowed to pay it again. After a long while, he looked up at Daniel. "You said the mountains used to feel like a prison," he said. "They did," said Daniel. Ethan thought about this in the serious, unhurried way he thought about everything now. Then he looked back at the trail ahead, at Ranger racing through the gold and green of a Montana summer, ears back, tail high, fully and completely alive in the only moment that has ever existed or ever will.
"They never were," Ethan said quietly. "You just needed someone to help you find the way out." Daniel stopped walking. He stood in the sunlight on the mountain trail, and he felt the weight he had carried for 13 years, the weight of a boy who died, the weight of a man who survived and could not forgive himself for it, shift, not disappear, not dissolve as if it had never been, but shift, the way a burden shifts when someone walks beside you and takes hold of one end, so that it is still real, still present, but no longer something you carry alone. He looked at the boy. He looked at the dog. He breathed the mountain air. And for the first time in a very long time, perhaps for the first time since that photograph above the fireplace, since that morning in the Afghan desert when a smile still came naturally, Daniel Hayes felt something settle in his chest like a thing coming home. He was not healed, he was not whole, he was not the man he had been before the war, but he was here, he was present, he was needed. And sometimes, as any old warrior will tell you, in the quiet honesty of the late hours when the defenses come down and the truth speaks plainly, sometimes that is enough. Sometimes that is everything. Ranger came bounding back down the trail, tongue out, eyes bright, checking on his people the way he always had and always would. He pressed his scarred flank against Daniel's leg and looked up at him with those amber eyes that had never once, not in war, not in grief, not in all the long silent years of the mountain, given up on the man beside him. Daniel reached down and placed his hand on the dog's broad head. "Come on," he said to both of them. "Let's go home." And the three of them walked on together into the light, two old warriors and the boy they had carried out of the dark, while the mountains held them gently, the way the mountains hold everything that has suffered and survived and found its way at last to peace. If this story reached into your chest and touched something real, if you thought of someone you love, or a dog who never left your side, or a moment when someone found you in your darkness, then you already know why this channel exists. Silent Paws and Brave Hearts was built for you. For the ones who feel deeply, for the ones who understand that the greatest courage is not found on battlefields, it is found in the quiet decision made every single morning to keep going. If you haven't subscribed yet, please take one moment right now. Press that button. Every subscriber tells us that these stories matter, that loyalty matters, that love matters, that no one, no veteran, no child, no soul who has survived something hard should ever feel forgotten. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. You may not know who they are, but they will know. The moment they hear it, they will know it was meant for them. We'll see you next time, right here, where the paws are silent, the hearts are brave, and no one ever walks alone. Silent Paws and Brave Hearts.